Good evening. Here's the central question. I live in Texas, not too far from the American border. Now, Minnesota is close to the border. In fact, it's got a border with Canada. But what kind of puzzles me is that really we don't have a big problem with immigration in Minnesota. And yet, our defective president, the one who can't seem to properly carry out the law, as is his job, he's got he is concentrating a heck of a lot of ICE personnel in Minnesota. I remember, I remember year after year after year after year of President Trump talking all about how terrible the open border policy is. Everything open, open, open. Now, I pointed out repeatedly that, you know, Biden was actually sending more people back than Trump was. But evidently, for them, if Biden didn't completely solve the whole immigration problem, if he didn't, I guess, scare the living daylights out of anybody who was trying to come over the border, then he hadn't opened the border policy. That seems to be what Mike I came to the conclusion of is that their idea was if you didn't, if you didn't just completely act like a barbaric, you know, madman towards the immigrants of this country. And now it seems like it doesn't even matter what kind of immigrant you are, whether you are legal, whether you are undocumented, whether you have a visa. If you said something bad about Trump, now that seems like grounds to kick you out. You can't seem to have an opinion that is critical of the United States of any kind. Um, you know, it just seems like the problems he is trying to solve, if you go by what he's doing, don't seem to be the problems that we were actually promised that he would take care of. And this sort of failure, well, it's not unexpected from the person involved. I mean, let's just be blunt about that. This guy has never been a very good person at doing what he said he was supposed to do. Because you know what? It's not about us. It's not about what we want. Even though the whole point of the presidency is to be a public servant, guess what? He didn't seek the presidency to be what he was supposed to be. He sought the presidency in order to be powerful, to gain power and money and legal immunity for himself. It was never about anybody else but him, for him. The rest of us, of course, disagree. The rest of us think that the point of the presidency is to carry out the laws of the nation. But what are all the ICE folks in Minnesota doing? Minnesota was not one of these states that were confronted by the big caravans. It wasn't. It was not at all one of these problem states. It wasn't like Arizona or I guess Nevada, California, um, Texas. You know, only the state that's got the Rio Grande, you know, which people cross in order to get into this country. But maybe immigration was never for these people about actually, you know, you should comply with our laws and, come across you know, like a good person, pay your fees, do do all the steps in the process. You have to do it the right way. And yet, ICE officials are picking people out of line in to undertake the ceremony to swear allegiance to the flag for citizenship. That's how late they seem. Yeah, that's the way they seem to be doing it. Most likely because guess what? We have basically hired a bunch of goons and promised them that they'll get a lot of money if they detain a lot of people. And so they don't particularly seem to give a rat's ass if they are going to pick up people who are citizens, who are born citizens, who are have green cards, who are here legally, who have judgments, things that would be basically cleared up if they were actually going through this thing called due process. Due process, like you need to, meet this, and this condition in order to take somebody and deport them. But they don't want to bother with that. Why don't they want to bother with that? I can give you two words as a reason. And those two words are ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing? Are we getting a little extreme here? Just listen to the talk, listen to the rhetoric with open ears, and you'll hear it. Replacement theory. What is replacement theory about? Oh, we bring in so many immigrants, and the immigrants displaced the white people. This is explicit. This is in its origin a white supremacist trope. And the idea is that the evil powers that be want to change the way the politics go. And that is one of their main arguments. It's one that our lovely friend Tucker Carlson has been pushing forward, replacement theory, making this all a very political matter, putting that forward as one of the fundamental reasons to do this because it seems, oh, if you let the immigrants come in, the Democrats will have more power. This is one of the things they've been saying outright. But I think people don't want to actually listen through all the way to the implications of what they're saying. They're saying that part of the reason why they're pushing the immigration policy that they are is that it benefits them politically. Think about that for a second. Isn't that kind of a corrupt, sort of conflict of interest? Here's the thing: a vote, a Latino vote, is not necessarily going to be a Democratic vote. There are plenty of Latinos out there who are conservative, who are, who are strongly Catholic, who are they work hard. They look at folks who take the illegal way through, and they despise those people. They're not necessarily the folks who are in love with the idea of illegal immigrants flooding in and taking the jobs and so on and so forth. The key here is that I guess it's a matter of orthodoxy, because a lot of GOP a lot of GOP politics has revolved around getting people who look like me and who have my equipment attached, getting those people to vote, to keep voting for Republicans. And we see this sort of exploitation of racial tensions. We see it going back all the way to 1968, 1972. We see this exploitation of racial tensions. Why? Because it's an easy way for the Republicans to crack and break down the former Democratic dominance of politics. I mean, you go back to 1964, and you have LBJ basically, you know, landslide, flattening Goldwater, and he's got this the North, and the South together with him. His margin of victory, his popular vote is 64, 65%. You know, real mandate, real landslide. And we go forward just a couple decades, and it's the Republicans who have had repeated landslides. Like, you look at Nixon's elections, you look at Reagan's elections. These were not, slight victories. So the Republicans, they've kind of gotten used to exploiting the racial tensions, exploiting the resentment of social, social welfare, social safety net measures. They've been kind of stirring that up for decades. But you got these people coming in from Mexico, from Central and other parts of Latin America, and guess what? They are, a lot of them are conservative. A lot of them maybe even have a sort of a right wing sensibility, but they won't necessarily be your doctrinaire uh, your doctrinaire Republican if they add to conservatism. And if you they won't necessarily be 100% against social safety net stuff. I think I think these people, I think they have this notion that somehow, if they keep everything white, if they keep everything Northern European, in fact, that this will preserve the quality of the country. But the truth of the matter is, this country has always had this sort of crappy sort of, you know, chorus of people saying, "Oh, look at these terrible people coming in." I mean, if you look at my name, um, Darty, Daugherty, it's an Irish name, and in times past, Irish were very much looked down on. Not so much anymore. People have just forgotten that it was such a that was such a hang up. But yeah, you look at I think a good movie if you want sort of an artistic impression of this is the Gangs of New York, where basically um, what's his name? I'm forgetting. I'm forgetting that actor's name. The guy with the big top hat, the American Eagle, glass eye, Daniel Day Lewis. That's his name. The character Daniel Day Lewis plays. Listen to his dialogue. Listen to what he's talking about, and that reflects some actual history from the 18, from before the Civil War. Some actual history. This notion of you know the Irish and the Catholics being invaders. So when somebody calls the folks, coming in over the border, legally or illegally, when they say, "Oh, look at these invaders," they're not exactly the first people in American history to do that. It seems like every time there's been a wave of immigrants from somewhere in the world that didn't fit into what we already had established, you know, there, there's always been somebody who's called it an invasion, even though it's not, who has made hysterical claims about, oh, it's just terrible. Oh, it's going to uh, people are going to the country is going to become stupider as a whole, or these people are going to be controlled by this foreign leader, or whatever. I mean, people used to say, "Oh, don't let Chinese people into the country because they'll be given orders by the Chinese emperor," or "Don't let Catholics in because the Catholics will be taking orders from the Pope." Uh, I think the Pope wished he had that much control over his, Catholics. You know, uh, but all this, these, I see this guy chisel fingers. I see his little messages there. What is ICE doing that's illegal? Well, for one thing, ICE is detaining people, even citizens, without a warrant, without probable cause. That's pretty much illegal. Uh, Killing people without an actual defense, like you're not actually allowed to just stick yourself in front of a vehicle and shoot the person because the vehicle's coming at you because you're standing there like a dumbass. You know, Cops are actually trained not to do that. For one thing, because it's we see it in movies. We see the car coming at the good guy, and the good guy is going like bang, 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 and the idea is, oh, the guy gets shot, and then and then the car you know careens off the road and hits a light pole or something. You know that's what people are thinking in their minds. You know that's what the But the reality is, well, for one thing, it's an idiot thing to do. Because if you don't have the reflexes of a stuntman, you're not going to be able to dodge the darn thing. Or if you do manage to take out the driver, guess what? You now have a car that's out of control with a dead or a dying or at least wounded person in the driver's seat, which can get civilians killed, which can destroy other people's property. It looks good on film, even when even when the car crashes into something, it looks good in film. But what looks good on film is not what works well in reality. You know, it's not about what looks good on film. It's not about this sort of Hollywood fantasy about how law enforcement is supposed to work. One of the reasons why we require either probable cause or a warrant, well, it's something about the way the framers wanted the system that they were creating to work. And that is that it had to be conditional. You give government a whole bunch of power to carry out the laws of the land, but it's given so that the country, so that those authorities, they have to fulfill conditions in order to get that power, in order to, carry out that power. So a police officer cannot just shoot a civilian because they feel like it, because a civilian isn't, jumping fast enough when they order them to. Compliance is not Non-compliance is not a death penalty case automatically. Now, if you've got somebody who is trying to shoot another person, maybe their wife, maybe their brother, maybe somebody who owes them money, and you have to shoot that person, or else that other person's going to shoot somebody else, that's reasonable. That is, you know, I had to defend somebody else's life. And if they're turning around and trying to shoot you, well, it's not really, even if it turns out to be a mistake, even if the person just like, oh God, I'm pointing a gun at the police officer. It's understandable if the police officer can't read the person's mind and go, oh, that person doesn't actually want to shoot me. If they see that gun pointed at them, they might well shoot because, oh, somebody's pointing a gun at me. But if you got something like a woman, I mean, here's one of the things that we see with ICE again and again, and it's that the violence is not necessary to carry out their duties. In fact, the question is, are they there to carry out their duties at all? Are they actually there to carry out their duties? I mean, we seem to have a whole lot of people in Minnesota for some godforsaken reason to deal with our immigration problem. But wait a second. Isn't Texas the place that has more of an immigration problem? Why isn't it here? Why isn't it here? And the answer is because ICE isn't being deployed to carry out the laws of the land. That is not the practical purpose for which they are being sent to Minnesota, to one of the whitest, least, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but Minnesota does not strike me as one of the more, if there are immigrants coming through, they're Canadian or they're French or they're something else, because that is not, there is a substantial amount of distance between Minnesota and the southern border, which is what we were sold on. We had caravans, 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 you know, coming at us. And that was what the second Trump administration was sold on. And do we have tons? Do we have all these ICE? We have had ICE become the most expensive of all our law enforcement entities. We are spending billions upon billions upon billions upon billions, more than the FBI, more than the Drug Enforcement Agency, more than any other of our law enforcement agencies. We are spending that money on ICE to deal with a supposed influx of illegal immigrants. And where are they now in the greatest of numbers? Minnesota. Not on the southern border where it was supposedly such a grave crisis that we had to deploy, these insidious man traps, that were intended to kill people trying to swim across the Rio Grande. No, we're not doing that. We're not dealing with that area. We're not dealing with that state. We're dealing with Minnesota. We're dealing with Minnesota. Something is wrong here. Something is not adding up, which is not at all an unusual thing given our defective president's bankruptcy filled past. But another thing that's not adding up, why did folks feel the need? Why is there so much need to project force against civilian citizens in Minnesota? What is the point of all that? What is the point? How does that serve the underlying purpose of ICE? Its jurisdiction. ICE is an enforcement agents. I mean, the name of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Now, these guys sure as hell aren't doing customs work. They're uh, supposed to be doing immigration work, but they seem to be more involved in shooting tear gas at protesters, at shooting tear gas at trick or treaters, anybody, everybody, but who they were actually supposed to be dealing with. I know it's, oh, they're all dealing with the interference with federal officers, which is a crime. The, it seems to me like they're getting rather distracted. They're more interested in detaining protesters, in going after people wearing dinosaur costumes. I've seen video of them going after a guy who was dancing with a fox mask. This is insane. This is not ICE's job. If you want to deploy some people to do crowd control, get the local police to do it. if you've got these ICE people out there in their masks, in their you know their body armor. Yeah, I mean, they're in this body armor stuff half the time, and they've got all their guns and they got all their their masks and things like that. I mean, I should tell them that dehumanizing yourself by with a mask is actually a good way to cue yourself up as a fascist enemy who deserves to be defeated. I mean, just ask George Lucas and with Star Wars. You know, wear a helmet, wear a mask, and guess what? You take away some of your own humanity. They're making themselves look like cannon fodder, and that might be actually the entire point. And that's one of the disturbing things is that the Trump administration, the defective president administration, seems to be aimed at trying to provoke unrest with the presence of their officers, with the presence of their military personnel, which is the opposite, of course, of what those personnel are given to the president, the authority to lead them. He's supposed to deploy those in order to quell unrest, in order to calm situations down, in order to lower the tension level. But our buddy Trump seems to be wanting to raise the tension level. I mean, let me. Uh, this featured a lot in one of my previous videos, but let's just start out and this opened up pretty quickly to this part. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility. Ensure domestic tranquility. That is part of the preamble of the Constitution. Provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our prosperity. Our posterity. Sorry. Do ordain their. I mean, what this is telling you is that their intention was to create a situation where people were where things were tranquil, where things were peaceful. But Trump seems to be deploying tons and tons of ICE agents to Minnesota where they're not particularly needed because he wants to use these people to gin up a threat to which he can respond with force. Does that seem to you the sort of thing that the framers of the Constitution would want their leader to be doing? Provoking a contentious controversy with the people of a state so that they can go in and apply more draconian force to them by way of the National Guard. No. When we were starting out this country, George Washington, you know, his government was trying to apply a tax, a tax to whiskey, and the folks making that whiskey weren't too happy about that. So they began to rumble about, we're going to cause some sort of insurrection here. So George Washington set out with a He sets out with an army, goes towards where these whiskey rebellion folks are, starts marching, and by the time he gets there, it's mostly it's mostly taken care of. They're not the everything is simmered down, and you see this from time to time. But the exercise of this sort of power is meant to simmer things down. It's meant to reintroduce the the rule of law, to reinforce, to reinforce a sense of peace, to quell a sense of fear. We are not supposed to be a nation that is ruled by fear, by the threat that if you don't comply, you will die. If you don't comply, we will take you out of line and beat you. If you don't comply, we'll take you out of line and shoot you. That is not the style of this government. In fact, your life is guaranteed to you by this Constitution. That is the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment says that a person's life, liberty, and property will not be taken from them except through due process of law. That's the thing. Our we're not supposed to, it's not just, oh, you're free. But if the government wants to come in, they can just take it without any problem. You either comply with the government or you're dead. No, our government was built. There is force. There is force that an officer can use against the citizen, but it's only to defend their life or the life of somebody else. It is not to force compliance. It is not to force compliance. We are not supposed to be a nation that lives in fear of our government. That is not supposed to be the way we maintain peace and tranquility. Because in general, when you try and do that, when you try and keep peace and tranquility by imposing violence on people, the minute you turn your back, the minute you turn your back, everything can go. The minute the power is not applied, government falls. We created a government that maintains the peace, maintains law and order by agreement. Now, I know that sounds kind of idealistic. I know that sounds kind of extreme, but that is part of the point of the United States of America. That we are not simply a nation of subjects, of people who are, have no say in when what the rules are, who have no say in how we are governed, who have no say in what the leaders of our country do. We govern in what Douglas Hofstadter would call a strange loop, an entangled hierarchy, something where the bottom of the org chart can turn around and affect what's at the top. And in fact, that is part of what our defective president played on in order to get people to elect him. His common refrain has been, I'm not a politician. which is very funny given that he has been running, holding political rallies for the last 10 years. He hasn't stopped. He never even stopped, even when he lost the election. He started up his reelection, his next election campaign almost immediately. And even when he was president, most presidents, once they get into office, there's a time where they kind of rest and relax, and they don't start up their next campaign until the next election is close at hand. But Trump, he starts them up almost instantly. Part of it is that well, he gets plenty of money from his supporters, and he uses his campaign funds as a piggy bank. The way in which this guy doesn't do what he promises to do, what he's supposed to do, it shouldn't be shocking if you understand that he's a sociopath. But when I call him a sociopath, I don't mean he's one of those smart as hell chess masters that you see in movies. He's more like just a person who doesn't give a rat's ass about actually following any kind of rules. And that includes the rules that protect you. He sees absolutely no problem with a bunch of bullies, a bunch of ICE agents ganging up. I mean, yes, it's annoying to have a woman's car be in the way when you're trying to get around. It's annoying. I understand why no police officer would particularly enjoy that. Why they might get angry at the woman for being a smartass about it. I understand. And it could actually be that she committed a crime by doing those things. But the response, we have an Eighth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment basically says that, cruel and unusual punishment is prohibited. But why? Well, you know what? Because perhaps the framers, the James Madison, perhaps these folks had a sense that the punishments ought to fit the crimes, and if it's a minor crime, then it should be a minor punishment. This notion that the police, if you're messing around with them, have the right to lash out at you with lethal force. I've heard this so much. I've heard so much justification that basically amounts to, oh, you didn't comply, so now, they should be able to shoot you. You know, if you complied, you'd be alive. If and the problem with this whole thing is that this is actually the opposite of what the Constitution says. The Constitution says a person's life, liberty, and property shouldn't be taken from, shall not be taken from them without due process of law. This should, there has to be a good enough justification for a person to use lethal force, or else it shouldn't be used at all. And also, there's this sense of, we're not going to even bother to, escalate in stages. We're going to go straight from, oh, you're annoying us, to, all right, I'm going to pull my gun on you. And if you don't get out of the car, I'm going to shoot you in the head. Doesn't this seem a little bit excessive? Doesn't this seem a little bit nuts? That's the thing. Folks are not registering how nuts this all is on the right. They've been so steeped in propaganda that they haven't paused to think. They haven't paused to think things through. They haven't paused to think, okay, if I were in this situation, if some agents under a Democratic administration, I mean, we've been through this. It's y- y- they got bent out of shape over the what happened on that farm on that ranch in Ruby Ridge, whatever it was. They got bent out of shape over that, and bent out of shape over Waco, and but and they get bent out of shape that, oh, people were a woman was shot in the Capitol. Oh, she was just a protester. She was just trying to get those people's autographed by crawling through a broken window that had just been shattered by a violent mob. And she was, what was she going to do after that? This Ashley Babbitt that they consider such a martyr. What was Ashley Babbitt going to do? That's the question they don't ask. They don't ask, for people who say, we're just asking questions, these folks don't seem to ask a lot of obvious questions. Questions that might be, kind of pertinent. Like, if this guy steps one, two, three steps to the side, is he clear of the vehicle? Yes. Does that mean that he can survive without having to shoot this woman and just tell the police to pick her up later on whatever charges that they are able to make stick? Maybe that would work, and there wouldn't be such bloodshed, and there wouldn't be this kid who's down one parent because somebody had to get somebody had to carry out their anger against the citizens who weren't going to comply, or who weren't going to cooperate, who weren't going to stop filming them, who weren't going to stop protesting them. And this is the thing. These people, these law enforcement agents, they are doing the opposite of what law enforcement agents are supposed to do with the public, and that is keep the peace and carry out the law. They're not carrying out the law. They are, in fact, often infringing on the law. You are not supposed to be able to just detain somebody in this country. If you're not, if you don't have probable cause to detain somebody, like at the very least a broken taillight if you're a cop, or say a warrant or a notice of some kind saying that somebody has overstayed their visa, or that somebody has uncertain, you know, uncertain documentary status. You shouldn't be picking up a young citizen out of out of a store where he's an employee, roughing him up and depositing him in absolute tears several minutes later. That is not carrying out the law. That is breaking the law. That is betraying the law. That is acting like a criminal thug. That is acting like a cartel enforcer, like a mafia soldier, rather than an agent of the law. The rule of law in this country, the rule of constitutional law in this country, it's there because you know what? As much as we would hope that people would be angels, as much as we would hope that people would be good as law enforcement and not be corrupt and not be distractible and not be apt to abuse their power, well, guess what? Unfortunately, some folks are. Some folks get power and it goes to their head. Some people get power and they never really intended to use it properly in the first place. And when we just go, oh, do you want these people to to deport all the bad immigrants? Do you want them to, you know, take down the drug trade? Do you want them to protect you against the communists? Do you want them to protect you against this threat or that threat, against the terrorists, and so forth? And this logic is used to say, then we have to let them do whatever they want. Anytime we constrain them from doing whatever they want, that means we are keeping them from doing their job. And that's the idea that many people like to promote. And it's a bullshit idea. It's a bullshit idea. If we want people to stick to doing their job, if you want to prevent corruption in the job, if you want to prevent the power from going to their heads, then they have to have that power, which they exercise on a conditional basis. So if you've got, they have to be restricted to doing their job and not to just simply freely use authority and power without constraint. Because if that's what we go for, then, it doesn't stop when it's convenient for you. It doesn't stop when it edges into areas where you start to get alarmed. It doesn't stop this giving of absolute power. It doesn't stop when they turn on you. Look at Soviet history. Look at the history of many empires and monarchies where basically one moment you are on top, like the leader of the secret police under Stalin, this Beria guy. Well, Stalin dies, and guess what? Not long after that, guess what? Beria gets shot. Beria gets executed. Why? Well, because guess what? If you're living in a totalitarian state, once you said that they can take anybody's life they want, you know, if they don't comply, if they don't do whatever, once you start making the requirement of the person to do what the state wants them to do or to believe what the state wants them to believe in order to maintain their life, their liberty, their property, once you make that the condition, then, well, guess what? All it takes for you to lose everything is for the party to turn on you, is for somebody to go, well, you know what? I don't like this person, or this person is a rival, so I'm going to take them down. This violence, this barbarity in Minnesota, this use of our nation's law enforcement powers against the people, against the populace, this is not tolerable. This cannot be allowed. This cannot be sustained because at the end of the day, this Constitution that we live under, this Constitution works in part because the law says that in order to exercise their power, the government has to prove things in a case, has to prove, has to go through a whole bunch of trouble. And at any point, if they haven't done their job, they can, your life, your property, your liberty can be restored as the case falls apart against you. And in fact, that's part of the point of another one of the Fifth Amendment's provisions, the provision against double jeopardy. You know, that you're not supposed to just keep on trying to convict a guy of breaking the law. You have one shot at convicting a person of an offense, and if that doesn't work, it's done. So this discourages frivolous prosecution. Again, we are getting the government to basically focus on doing its job because if they don't do their job, then they'll fail. If they don't do the job, then the law tells them that's done. You no longer have the power to prosecute this person. And that's the key. We don't have a system where the system is so weak that it can't do anything. That basically you have no power to, arrest somebody, that you have no power to defend, somebody's life if somebody's shooting, pointing a gun at them. No, instead, it is you have that power, but on the condition that you first, that you prove that you merit that power at this point, and and on the condition that the thing is that it's like you have to do it right. You have to do your job. You have to do what it is that people think that a prosecutor, think that a cop should be doing. That cop should be gathering evidence to prove a case, to, you know, generate probable cause for a warrant, for an arrest, and then having done that, prove, gather enough evidence to make a case, and the case has to be made it strong enough by the prosecutor. That's, what we would think that prosecutor would be doing. Make the case strong enough to where it, you know, beyond a reasonable doubt. That's what we would think that we would want a somebody running a trial to do, and so on and so forth. This is supposed to act. A cop shouldn't just be able to just plow over somebody, murder them because they don't follow orders with sufficient speed, with sufficient enthusiasm. Once you get around to doing that, you're kind of creating a country where we just live in fear of the authorities and we just, you know, clear out of the way when they come through, and so on and so forth. Now, I know you don't want the opposite, where you've got people constantly interfering, where the rule of law cannot be applied, because then, in real terms, you know, it, whoever has the ability to project violence in that case will have the power of law. But really, that's no excuse to have a system where basically the opposite is true. It's supposed to be a moderated. It's supposed to fall somewhere in the middle, you know, where they have enough power to do their job, but that power is only given to them so long as they follow a set of rules, so long as they work by evidence, by reason, in order to attest to this fact, in order to fulfill this condition, and by doing that, be able to exercise that power in a fair and just way. That's the idea. That's how you get freedom. You know, if somebody can't take your life, can't take your liberty, can't take your property, can't take your pursuit of happiness from you just on the basis of, they don't like you that day, or they think you're up to something. They think you're involved in something. If they have to actually gather evidence in order to interfere of your life before, a court will let them, before, the other authorities will let them, then you got a system that actually practically protects your freedoms. Now, obviously, it seems Minnesota has pissed off Donald Trump. They've done something to to tick off our would-be king, our defective president. And that's why Minnesota is being singled out here. But I think at the end of the day, if you support what our defective president is doing in Minnesota, you know, there is nothing that will prevent your president, your defective president, from betraying whatever restrictions you thought you had on him, whatever bounds of reason, whatever bounds of logic or fact or whatever, political, political loyalty. Oh, I couldn't. It's like the farmers. He goes around abusing tariff authority, and now the farmers go, "Oh, I couldn't have anticipated that this would happen." You know, I mean, people were telling them that it could happen, that he might abuse it, that he might do bad things with it. But you know what? They're thinking of Trump too much as just a wild and crazy guy that still has a heart of gold. They've got that sort of sensibility that he's the best leader. He's a great leader. He's a leader who supports America first. They've got that idea in their heads that he is loyal to them, that their loyalty will be returned with his loyalty, that he won't do something to harm them because they did something to help them. And the thing about that is that Trump does not operate with any kind of sense of, i- i- anytime anybody thinks that he owes them anything, they're going to find out that Trump honors no debts. Trump is a lousy debtor, and He's sort of that guy in the parable in the Gospels, where it's like, okay, the king has forgiven this guy's debts, but this guy goes out and he goes trying to shake down the people who owe him money, and so that's what Trump is like. He's that kind of person. And if you think that just because you were a state that supported him, that just because you did all the right things, that you supported him, that you support the great things that that he promotes, you think that just because of that, he can't or won't turn on you. And that's the thing about absolute power is that even if you have the best possible person in charge, you by giving that person absolute power, absolute immunity, you give them the ability to screw you over no matter what. They're not going to there's nothing to stop them. You've taken out all the stops. You've taken out all the conditional stuff that they have to do in order to use the power. You get somebody who promised you everything, but you have no way of holding them accountable. And this is the thing. This is what people need to keep in mind. This person in the comments, he probably thinks that Trump will never betray him, that Trump won't do bad things to him, that he won't suffer consequences. But you know what? Now that his party has given that guy so much in the way of power, authority, the ability to defy the order of the Constitution. There's nothing to stop the guy. If people don't stand up, there's nothing to stop him from doing bad things to everybody else and to them in particular. That's why you don't trust somebody with that kind of absolute power. That's why you keep even your friendly politicians under the leash of the Constitution. Because the idea is not to just simply trust that people with power will keep their promises, will do good, will act like angels. This is basically not being naive, not lacking common sense about how some people are just rotten. Some people don't keep their promises. Some people need to be constrained. And if you don't build in the power to constrain them into your system, well, there's not much you can do when they turn on you, when they betray you, or when they just simply accidentally, misuse their power. And I guess this is where I'm going to cut it short for the evening. But really ask the question: is this necessary? Was it necessary to surround a woman in a van for blocking the road, to surround her, to pull a gun on her, to threaten her life, and then shoot her? Was this a necessary escalation, or could they just have driven past, driven past, or let her drive past? Either way, the situation would have been diffused, and it's very unlikely that anybody would have suffered any sort of additional consequences for that. But too much. The right wing these days is steeped in propaganda designed to get them as angry, as fearful, as irrational as possible. So they agree to this kind of ab, you know, acceptance of absolute power in the leadership. And what they don't get is that you know nobody can take care of all the possible um, nobody can take care of all the possible threats that you face. Nobody can protect you from everything. Ultimately, it's a promise that can never be kept and will never be kept. It's better to deal with people in a proper relationship where you've got some means of stopping things when they go way out of control, like they have in Minnesota. So, have a good night.